Welcome all to my presentation at the ECS PRiME 2020, and today I'm going to be talking about my work on water distribution in fuel cell gas diffusion layers using a mechanistic discrete particle model. My name is Daniel.niblett and I am a PhD student in my third year at the University of Manchester. As you can see by this image here on the left, that's me, and these two images here are showing what this talk is going to be about. So it's about the water distribution in droplets forms in the channel of fuel cells. So to introduce the concept and the idea, basically what happens is when hydrogen passes across the membrane to the catalyst site in the cathode catalyst layer, water is produced by the electrochemical reaction, and this water then percolates out through the gas diffusion layer into the gas channels from discrete points based on percolation from the catalyst layers. And you can see that from this image on the top left here that this fuel cell device structure is usually incorporates two channels with an air supply channel and a hydrogen supply channel, and at the interface between the gas diffusion layer and the gas channel there is a porous material called the gas diffusion layer, and this is a fibrous type of material, as you can see here by these 3D renderings, and the water emerges from the pores of this material into these air supply gas channels. And we're interested here in this talk, how do these droplets emerge and accumulate in this channel? So I've done some volume of fluid simulations, as you can see here by this video, where from water injection into a gas diffusion layer material, you can see that there are multiple discrete clusters that form along the channel, either in the center of the channel or close to the channel walls, which then means they may interact with the side walls. And what we also notice is that these droplets and droplet shapes inside the channel follow a kind of spherical geometry, which is interesting because it means that we can simplify the modelling of this process. Furthermore, these kind of simulations, as I've shown here, take a considerable amount of time and resources. So using this volume of fluid method, even with a coarse mesh, it'll still take several weeks on multiple CPU parallelized. So although we're looking at water droplets emerging from single points, you can also look at the way that these water droplets interact with each other through coalescence and accumulation and water distribution that covers the gas diffusion layer surface. And this happens in a very complex process over time. As you can see here, the flow is now transitioned into slug-like, film-like flow, which is different from the start of the simulation where all the droplet kind of flow was dominated by discrete clusters. This means that there are quite complex time and spatial effects occurring in the channel, and to study these you need models which are efficient and fast. So what I found out and what I visualized in the simulations from the volume of fluid is, by looking at the interfaces, there are shapes that are commonly found throughout the simulations. So I've named them emerging droplets that are just emerging from the pores, isolated droplets that are in the center of the channel, which are disconnected from other droplets. And we have the sidewall droplets where they're connected to the gas diffusion layer surface and the sidewall. And then we have corner droplets which are attached to the top wall and the corner wall. And then we have capillary bridge droplets, which are truncated capillary bridges by the channel walls that are on the top surface of the channel walls. And then we see film-like structures, which is a deformation of the capillary bridge structure along in the channel direction due to external forces which cause the deformation. So from this I kind of thought that, okay, the water cluster shape is determined by the regime, okay, so each of these regimes, the volume of that droplet and the wall contact angles that the surfaces are based on. So I developed explicit equations for droplet dimensions for each of these regimes using kind of schematics, as you can see here. and this meant that I was able to develop explicit equations for the radius of curvature of each of these shapes as a function of volume and the contact angles of the various walls. And we can test these equations as shown on the bottom right here, where I've changed the different wall contact angles for the same droplet volume, and you can see how the droplet shifts up or down the wall depending on what contact angles are chosen. We then move to, okay, now we need to consider the water volume conservation, so water by water injection and by coalescence, because what this means that water is conserved from the production from either injection or the reaction. So we have an injection algorithm and a coalescence algorithm which tracks when the radius of two droplets collide, and then from that the parent droplets will be deleted and there will be a new droplet that is made from this. And you can see this in this simulation here, where we're injecting from a single pore. The droplet then interacts through the channel wall and grows to a certain size until it reaches the corner, and then it keeps feeding that corner droplet through detachment and coalescence cycles until the capillary bridge type structure is formed. This kind of information is then passed to a force balance algorithm, where we look at the drag forces and the surface adhesion forces which act to keep the droplet structure in place. And from this, from the momentum balance, we can work out what is the acceleration of the discrete droplet. So we track this in a Lagrangian way, which means that we can also look at the components which make up the drag force. So as shown now by the images on the right, through the volume of fluid simulations, we can actually try to validate these forces and check if our analytical equations are valid enough to simplify the process of the air flowing around these objects. So we've got the shear force, the viscous shear force, shown on the left here, and then we have the inertial shear force, which is on the right, which is due to the acceleration of air around the obstacles and the fact it's confined flow and relatively high Reynolds number in these channels. We also have the adhesion force, which is related to the surface tension, and it's the capillary reaction which acts on the contact line normal to the direction of flow, and also incorporates the deformation in terms of the advancing receding contact angles. Using this, we can then formulate the whole flow process of the model, where we can integrate with time explicitly, and we can track the volume, velocity positions, droplet configurations, coalescence, and different algorithms which allow us to build this mechanistic model of how droplets form and interact inside the channel. Now there's several assumptions we use, such as one-way coupling, which means we don't track the air explicitly, isothermal incompressible conditions, droplet-droplet collision is instantaneous coalescence, and droplet deformation is neglected in the droplet stages, but we have incorporated film flow for the capillary bridge deformation into film-like structures. So this slide shows the initial conditions, so the initial droplet emergence conditions from several points, 139 in this case, and then we inject using a water production from a current density of 1.2 amps per centimetre squared, and then over 300 seconds you can see how the water distribution emerges in the channel by the visualization on the right here. We can also show this process dynamically in a video. As you can see, the water droplets emerging, coalescing into larger droplets, reaching the channel corners, and then eventually forming a plug structure over time. Now in this simulation there's no airflow, so this means that this only looks purely at the accumulation without any effect of the air. To semi-validate this, I set up a volume of fluid simulation and the mechanistic model simulation with identical boundary conditions and initial conditions. This includes the topology of the actual spatial location of the injection locations into this channel, and as you can see by the representation of the interfaces, there is quite a good agreement between the results for hydrophilic channel walls and hydrophobic channel walls. And now this is just an initial qualitative comparison, but if we look at the quantitative results, we can see that if we track the channel saturation and the area coverage ratio, so the amount of water that covers the gas diffusion layer surface, you can see that there also is a reasonably good agreement. There is obviously differences, but the level of accuracy that you're able to obtain, considering the speed of this type of modelling, is very promising. So for example here, even at the accelerated water injection rate of times 1,000 of usual fuel cell production of water rates, the volume of fluid channel took around 3 weeks on 16 CPU, whereas the mechanistic model it only took 8.3 seconds in this case. So with that kind of 200,000 times speed increase, the relative level of accuracy that you get is relatively acceptable because of the speed increase, which allows the effects of larger time and spatial effects to be studied in the channel. So this is what we do here. So now we know that, okay, the model's semi-validated. We can then see the effect of different air velocities in the channel. So on the top we have a hydrophobic channel in the green at 15 meters per second, and then orange is hydrophilic, and then the rest are hydrophilic as well. But as you can see, with the higher air velocities, droplets are being removed from the channel much faster than at a lower velocity, and with no velocity, droplets are not being removed. And these kind of results show a relatively realistic result in comparison to other simulation and experimental transparent views. Now, if you actually take this data and look at it in a profile, what you see on the left here are different graphs for the saturation profile, and then that saturation profile is divided into the regimes that water consists of. So whether it's in the plug flow, the film flow, or the bridge flow regimes, and they're identified by the different colours here. And as you can see, as you increase velocity, you actually transition out of plug flow regime into another type of regime where it's a mixture of corner flow and droplet kind of flow, and then going even further into higher 20 meters per second, you can see that corner flow almost doesn't exist in this regime. It's mostly purely droplet flow and removal. You can also see the saturation, how the saturation changes, and there's the peaks in the removal of droplets also increases in frequency with air velocity. On the right here you can see a kind of preliminary evaluation of the average pressure drop in the channel, where the average pressure drop has fluctuations and pressure peaks due to the formation of plug flow in the channel, as shown by these three lower results here. So what I can do with this simulation, because it's very fast, is we can generate a two-phase flow regime map where I completed 225 simulation cases where the markers show the results of the saturation regime profiles for each individual operating condition. So we vary the water velocity on the left and the air velocity on the bottom. And I've kind of put a bracket around the fuel cell operating range here, which is actually, okay, the water production rate that you would get at typical current density values. So with this model, I was able to extrapolate further well above the range of fuel cells, but also the fuel cell operating range that you can see. And what you can see here, there's a clear trend and correlation between different distributions of operating regime profiles, with film flow in the top right because of high deformation due to air velocities, and droplet type flow with air velocities that are very high but water velocities are very low, and that's because coalescence can't occur as easily in these modes. Now what we can do with this two-phase flow regime map is calculate the time averaged regime fractions and time averaged saturations for each of these runs, and then we can create a 3D regime map, as you see on the left here. Now this 3D regime map is to do with the time average distribution, because we simulate these cases for one channel, it's half a channel volume injection. And as you can see here, at different operating conditions, there's always a distribution of different regimes that exist. So it's never one type of flow, it's always a distribution of different types with droplet flows dominating at higher air velocities. What we can also see is that if we overlay saturation contour map on top of this, we can see that there's an interaction between the air and water velocities, where operating at, if you're trying to accelerate the computational simulation to study these effects, it may not be valid to do so, because not only are the saturation regimes different, but the area coverage ratio and saturation are different at the same air velocity, but not at the same water velocity, because of that gradient and that change in the saturation. Now this is only for one contact angle. You can do various other things with this, but it's just an example of the type of results that we can get from this type of modelling. Now what this kind of showed me is, if we actually go back, is that in the fuel cell operating range, so down here below 10 to the minus 4 water velocity, you can see that there is not much change in the saturation with increasing the water production in incremental amounts. So that led to the hypothesis and the idea that as you increase the current density, you increase the cluster density of water emerging from the gas diffusion layer. So I looked into several literature sources, as you can see on the left here, and looked at X-ray data, and I counted the number of clusters per millimeter squared, and I also performed a full area injection simulation to work out what's the finite limit of the number of clusters that can exist in a gas diffusion layer. And then I plotted an error function to this, and then I used this error function into another 60 simulation cases where I varied stoichiometry and current density and performed the same set of experiments, simulation cases. And as you can see, if we overlay saturation onto this, you can see that increasing the current density now increases the time average saturation by 10% in terms of the maximum and the minimum, and that stoichiometry has more of an effect at higher current densities than it does at lower current densities, and that's because of the scaling effect of the air, where you have more air velocity because of the higher production and higher reaction rates. So this is just a hypothesis currently, but I welcome anyone to help me with this idea. So future modifications that I'd like to add to this model. So I'd like to add phase change at different temperatures and inlet humidities. And I'd also like to include two-way coupling with air. So that includes the transport of oxygen and water vapour along with temperature, and improvements to the two-phase flow pressure drop. I'd also like to introduce transport into the porous layers with reaction, and also improve the force balances and analytical equations. So this is in a single MATLAB code, so if anyone would like to use this, then it'll be available upon request after the publication. So I'd like to conclude saying that the coalescence and wall attachment are significant mechanisms that can control water removal in the channel along long time scales and long spatial scales, and the distribution of different regimes can exist at different operating conditions shown by the two-phase flow regime map. Furthermore, the density of water clusters that emerge from the gas diffusion layer is very important in controlling the water accumulation and distribution in the channel. To end, this mechanistic model is able to efficiently model water-air two-phase flow in the channels, and may be extended and used for other devices such as electrolyzers and flow batteries, etc. I'd like to kind of end there just saying I'm coming towards the end of my PhD soon, so I'll be looking for postdoc and industry type positions if anyone is interested. Thank you all for listening to my talk. I'd like to welcome any questions. You can email me here, shown by my email address here. Thank you all.